Hello and welcome to this latest edition of Off Track with Carruthers and Bice, a special video edition. And we have Rick Hobbs on today, who is our race director and former crew chief and former denizen of the paddock. Now he kind of bosses the paddock around a little bit. But, you know, we're going to ask Rick a lot of questions, but I was his teammate at one time, and I happen to be an encyclopedia of knowledge for Rick's career. He's won 21 championships in Canada and the U.S. and 15 in the U.S. and it spans from those of you of a certain age like us. Steve Crevier is kind of when it started, and it went all the way through to Cameron Beaubier and the five that Cameron got. So, Rick, thanks for joining us, Paul and I, and really thrilled to have you on.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, even though the stairs were a little intimidating. But
oh yeah, whoops! I just dropped my phone. Just so you guys know, so we're up in this. I don't know what they call it. I guess
bird's nest.
The bird's nest. It's at the top of VIR's media center, and you go up a spiral staircase, which is narrow and wobbly, and not something that I ought to be doing too often. But we made it up here. It's quite hot, so you'll probably see me profusely sweating any moment here, if I'm not already. One of the other things I didn't mention about Rick too is Rick is actually in the Canadian Motorcycle Hall of Fame. Also, maybe ought to be in the AMA Hall of Fame as well. But you know, I'm going to work on that next. So
I'll leave that to you, Sean.
and one more thing, and we are going to ask you some questions, even though
I thought you were just going to do this by yourself and we could leave.
And just one of the most fascinating things about Rick is he's from the Yukon in Canada, which that is so cool. I mean, literally, it's cool and cold, but. But he started out, he was, you know, as you'd expect, snowmobiles, and did a lot of the two-stroke stuff in the old days, and it kind of went from there with motors. So,
Yep.
You know, Rick, the whole transition for you, let's kind of talk about, you know, your transition from being in the paddock with teams and now the race control. To me, it seemed like a natural progression, and I was thrilled to know that you were available to do it. So tell us how it's going with that.
It's going really well so far. We're only one race in, so. But yeah, it at first it was a little daunting to me to be in that position of race director, and you know, it's quite different from what I'm used to in the paddock, where I've spent many years in. But I think all of that ingrained knowledge from being in the paddock has helped me transition and feel more comfortable in that race director chair than somebody that might come from a different discipline or from a different background. So the other thing is that, you know, there's a terrific support group around me, and makes my life a lot easier because they can give me a poke in the ribs if I'm going the wrong direction on something, or just point things out that I might not necessarily see at first. So with both of those things kind of helping me out, it's been fairly smooth, knock on wood, and I look forward to doing it some more. I find it to be gratifying in a different way than what I found as a crew chief and engine builder in the competitor side of the paddock. So, but it's got its own kind of satisfaction that comes with a successful event. So.
Sean says he thought it was a natural progression. I'm of the thought that there was no way 5 years ago you thought you would ever be doing this.
Oh, no. In fact, even last year when I came and just kind of was a fly on the wall in race control, you know, I was still thinking at that time, man, I don't know how I could do this. You know, it seemed like there was a lot. But again, you know, having that experience last year and then having some time over the off season to kind of think about things and how I could improve my knowledge and fit better into that role. It helped me coming into the first race to be somewhat calm and not too nervous about it. So.
Well, I was going to bring that up because there seems to be, like, one of the things that I think would be important in that job is to have a level of calmness, which you have. And I think it probably, like, when hectic times in the pits, right?
Yep.
That calmness would come in handy.
Oh, yeah.
And it's obviously going to come in handy in this role as well, because you can't just you can't panic, you can't
Right.
lose control. You have to go about your business to the
Yeah,
best
and-
of your ability at that point.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that when you get into a stressful situation, a lot of times it feels like time is compressed, that you've got to make decisions on an instant. But in reality, you do have a little bit of time to think, so
More than you think, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so you
Yeah.
can't rush it. You
Right.
have the time.
you got to just say, okay, this is not something, there are certain situations where you just have to react immediately. But for the most part, you've got a little bit of time. And, I think about, a situation where you've got a crash that, there may be something on the racetrack. But then you think about it and go, okay, well, it's the first couple of laps. There's going to be a minute to a minute and a half before the first riders are going to get to where the incident is. Let's give it a few seconds to see if it gets resolved in time to not have to throw a red flag. So those are the situations where I think, having been in the pressure cooker before, it gave me a bit of a leg up, so to speak, to be able to think in a timely manner and make a decision. That helped me. I didn't feel panicky in those instances. So.
And I had discussions with previous regimes, pre-MotoAmerica, and my advice to them, to the one individual who was doing it at the time, was, I think erring on the side of caution usually is not going to get you in as much trouble as not.
Right.
And also I told him, I'm like, I think it would be the easiest thing to do is if you just pretended your son was out there. And what would you want for your son in this given situation? Sure. Do you think a red flag's important? Well, yeah, I would. Yeah. Well, then, pretend that's your son.
Yeah, and that's the way I've felt about a lot of the riders I've worked with, because there was a pretty significant age difference a lot of times, and especially as I got further into my career and I was working with guys that were honestly young enough to be my grandson.
Mm-hmm.
And so I often thought of them that way, and what advice would I give my grandson, and so I have that kind of connection, and I think that way kind of instinctively now, and so it I think that helps again, and my basic personality is pretty calm, especially now that I've gotten some more experience under my belt. When I was younger, I might have been a little quick to lose my temper.
Right.
Now
well, that'll be tested at some point.
I'm sure it will. But once again, through experience, I've learned just take a breath. Don't jump to conclusions, and don't be so quick to react that you get yourself in trouble. So that at least is my basis. And so obviously things can change, and you can veer from one side of that to the other. But for the most part, I think that's going to help me, in this job and going forward.
Yeah, you've got your base set up. You can just make little adjustments.
Yeah, it's kind of like that with a motorcycle. Once you get to that happy spot, you really don't have to vary too much. From track to track, it changes a little bit. Obviously gearing and so on. But once the rider is comfortable, then you have a routine and you kind of stick to that. So.
I think for the fans maybe that don't know what a race director is, I know it's there's a lot to it, but could you explain a little bit of what the job entails so people understand?
Wow, it's
a tough question. I know
it's kind of difficult to explain. It at first glance doesn't seem like I do very much, really.
But like Sean's job.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can relate. But no, it's kind of a subtle thing, and for the most part, it's my responsibility to make sure that the event goes off. The events go off on time, that we stick to the schedule, to interpret what's happening on the racetrack, and make sure that we're making the appropriate calls, whether it's for a crash or a bike that's got a mechanical problem that we need to get off the track, or and it's so there's some judgment calls in there that I'm responsible for. But we also have, again, a team of people that are experienced and with multiple sets of eyes and ears in the room with me. And so I don't feel like I am the sole
Right.
voice in the room. Some circumstances for red flags, for instance, that's my call, and I can have people advise me. But if if we get into a situation that I determine we need a red flag, I call it red flag. So to me, that's one of the bigger responsibilities,
Right.
because it affects everybody. It affects, if it's Superbike or the other televised classes, it affects the TV, it affects the competitors, it affects the teams, because then they've got to scramble to get prepped and ready to go again, another start. So there's a lot of consideration that has to go into it, but it also has to happen pretty quickly.
Right.
And so, uh, that's where my experience and um, my approach, I guess, thoughtfulness about, is this the right call to make or not, comes in handy. And again, because I've been in a position where I've had to make decisions kind of in a crunch, that it's becomes pretty instinctive, that I don't have to really overthink it, that it's more of, I'm seeing something, I know what the parameters are, I know how much time I've got, does this require X
Right.
response? So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Let me ask you about a specific situation. Now, I wasn't going to even ask you this, but since you mentioned about some decision making, so at Michelin Raceway Road, Atlanta, we had in the Twins Cup race, second race, Caleb DeCarroll had the crash that ended up taking out some other riders, and then after the fact, a little bit, Toby kind of came in. So you threw the red flag probably pretty quickly on that, and what looks like a crash is a crash. I mean, tell us about the process in that moment and how that worked.
Well, it's somewhat unusual to have multiple bikes go down at the same time. Not unheard of. Sometimes riders try to occupy the same space at the same time. It doesn't work out. So that was my first thought when I saw 3 bikes down in that turn. First thought was, are the riders getting up? Which they were. But then we had a 4th bike involved, and as soon as I saw the 4th bike coming in, I knew, without having to think about it, there was something on the racetrack. And so that's why I called it red flag, which to me, it seemed like it was, a long time from the first part of the incident to where we called red flag. But it was really just the gap between the 3 leaders and Toby. So, and that's a situation, that's the worst situation really, is a track surface that's got who knows what on it. And we didn't know that there was oil and water at the time. So it was really treacherous. And fortunately, nobody was seriously hurt in that situation. Some mechanical damage was done.
A little bit, yeah.
But yeah, so, there's different situations call for different response. That was one of them where it had to be instantaneous, because any riders coming into that corner unaware that there was something on the racetrack would quite likely be crashing. So, but then you have other situations where, single rider incident, the bike's on the racetrack, the rider's slow to get up. You kind of say, okay, where's the rest of the field? How much of a gap do we have before we're going to have somebody else come along? And so give the rider a chance to gather himself up and see if he can remove himself from the danger zone. And, sometimes the track marshals are right there. They can get to the bike and get it off the track, and you can continue without having to red flag it. But in one instance at Road Atlanta, we had a bike on the racing surface and a rider that was slow to get up, and it was early in the race, so we had a pretty good gap. So we waited for, I'd say, 10 seconds, give the rider a chance, and he started to move, and I'm like, okay, maybe we can get this. And then it turned out that he had some other injury that required an ambulance, and so there was no question at that point. You got to call the red flag so the ambulance can get to the rider, and so on. So Just gotta try to evaluate the situation and make an appropriate response. So, in those, for me, it was after the weekend that I was thinking about, oh man, did I call that the right way? Could we have done something different? And some of that is going to be a learning experience for me. Is what are my options, and can we do something different in the future?
Mm-hmm.
So that's my homework.
And it's always changing. But what's interesting with you is your long career as a crew chief in racing. You have watched a lot of racing.
Yeah.
You know what it looks like.
Right.
You knew what you saw there, so that helps you to make a decision, I'm sure.
Yeah. I know what looks normal and what doesn't.
Right.
And so it helps. And again, it becomes kind of instinctive. You don't even really think about it anymore. It's just like that's not right. Something's wrong with this
Right.
picture, right? So,
Right.
So yeah, and that again just gives me more support for my decision making, and that watching a motorcycle go by at 160 miles an hour is not new to me.
Mm-hmm.
I've been there, done that, seen it before. So I'm fortunate in that regard, and it's interesting sitting in the chair in race control because really I, in most cases, can only see a very small portion of the racetrack. Everything else is on a TV monitor.
Mm-hmm.
And multiple camera views. So you've got to constantly be scanning across all of these camera views, especially later in a race where the track, the field is spread out and all the way around the racetrack quite often. So it's different because in years past as a crew chief, I could focus on my rider and just follow him around. And so now having to scan and look for unusual things across the whole field is a bit different. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to get a little more used to that and working with the camera people and getting a different viewpoint and so on. So it's good.
So the decision making, I want to compare that with some decision making that you would often have to make, or not too often, but it would come up as a crew chief. And an example I'm thinking of is with Cameron Beaubier.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, I don't know what race, and I think it was a Super Pole, he crashed, lost the front end, kind of destroyed the bike.
Yeah.
Race coming up, all of a sudden you and your crew are all hands on that bike,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just a marvel to watch you guys. And you're hands on doing stuff. They are nobody gets in anybody's way.
Yeah.
Somehow you assess the damage. It's almost like triage, and you fix it, and he's back out for the race. I mean, there's a lot of decisions going on during that time period. Are you orchestrating that whole thing?
To some extent, yeah, because ultimately it's my responsibility to make sure that he's got a safe motorcycle and hopefully one that's back to condition that he can challenge for a win. That's those two things are pretty much foremost, and I am responsible for that. So as well as helping in those situations, I'm trying to take a big picture view as well and make sure that whoever's doing whatever repair work on the motorcycle is doing it to where it's going to be a safe motorcycle again.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's times when it's like you look at the clock, you look at the bike, you look at everybody that's helping, you look at what you've got for spares available and go, we're not going to make it, guys. It's not going to happen. So don't stress and rush to get this fixed because we're not going to make it.
Mm.
And then other times it's like, yeah, we can do this. We've got, in a red flag situation, for instance, you've got 5 minutes minimum. So right off the bat, as long as we get the bike back, we've got 5 minutes at least to evaluate and come up with a plan. In the meantime, even watching TV, sometimes you can see from a crash, just a simple low side. Okay, back to the truck and grab a foot peg assembly, grab a handlebar assembly, so you can kind of pre-stage stuff before the bike even gets back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a thought process that I've kind of grown accustomed to. It's like minimize the amount of things that you need to do at the moment. If you've got a plan and you've got things in place to help you when it comes crunch time. And that thought process works for a crew chief or a race director, or, anybody I think that has to think on their feet kind of thing.
And Paul, always with a calm demeanor too. I remember one time, me doing my PR side of it. Okay, Rick, is the bike okay? Not now, Sean. And it's like,
Right.
and I'm like, yeah, you're right. Yeah,
Right.
You're the crew chief. What am I
I'm an
doing?
idiot.
Yeah, and I just, I'm doing my job, and it's not the right time for me to do my job. So, it was all calm and handled respectfully, and it was all good. But let's talk about a little bit the advent of technology.
Mhm.
You talk about, you can see on the feed, we need a rear set. Well, when you didn't have a feed in the old days, how did you know what to do?
Quite often didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it was,
There
you
was
wait
no
till the
way.
bike gets back, and you try to have, prepared assemblies of the common things that fail in a crash, foot pegs and shifter and brake pedal and so on. But quite often you wouldn't know until the bike is actually physically back in the pit box.
Mm.
So yeah, the TV's helpful, but you also, I shouldn't say I became accustomed to having that. So there's times when a crash would happen out of view of the camera. And so we wouldn't know, is the bike coming back? Is the rider up? There's a lot of guessing going on at that point. So it's kind of nice in a way now being in the race director's chair, because I do have, 16 cameras to look at. And so I can follow around the track, and if I need to, I can communicate with the TV people to perhaps zoom in, zoom out, pan, to get a better view of what's going on. So, compared to watching whatever the TV production decides they're going to show to
Right, which is usually the
pit
leader.
wall, so it takes a little getting used to having that ability, and again, like I said, scanning, instead of focusing on one screen.
It's like the guy watching all the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park.
That's right.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
right.
kind of. Yeah. Yes.
So here's another weird one for you. This goes way back to when I was in school, back, in the one-room schoolhouse days, of Little House on the Prairie. But anyway, I remember our guidance counselor had a thing, and it was about data, people, or things. And it was like, what are you mostly into? And for me, I knew it wasn't data. I'm terrible in math. I like mechanical things, but I definitely like to hang around with people. Which are you, all three? What is your thing?
Wow. Yeah, I think I am.
I do too.
Yeah, I think that's, what I realized early on, that mechanically I'm okay. I'm good. I think of those three, I would say my people skills are probably the thing that has gotten me the most success. Mechanical stuff, that's pretty straightforward for the most part. Data, I had to learn how to use that and benefit from it. But people skills was more instinctive for me, and I think part of it was, as a kid, I moved a lot. My family moved a lot. And so I had to adapt, different environments, different, friends. I think I went to 14 different schools, growing up.
Yeah,
So
that's tough.
Yeah.
So that kind of gave me some tools that I didn't realize I had in being able to, relate to people and not feel uncomfortable in a room, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think that of those three things, I would have to say that being comfortable with people and new people, and how to deal with different personalities, and it's probably the biggest thing for me.
Another one here for a moment. Are riders crazy? I mean, really? I mean,
No.
you've worked with a lot of riders.
Yeah.
What are the similarities? What are the differences? Are riders as different among themselves as people are different, or are they all cut a little bit from the same cloth in some ways?
I would say that they're different. Everybody has their own personality as a rider. and what works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. They could wind up having the same amount of success, but from a totally different approach. And so, yeah, I don't think there's any one thing that I've noticed that makes a great rider. I think it's like a recipe. You're making soup, and you've got all these different ingredients that come into it. And sometimes you put a little more of one ingredient than another. Somebody likes potatoes more than they like carrots. I don't, but so I think that the recipe is different, but the end result is, some basic things. Typically very successful riders are very driven and very results oriented. They judge themselves pretty harshly at times, and so that maybe would be, if there was any one thing I would say, is that riders I've worked with that have been very successful, both with me and beyond, or before, that determination, drive, ability to overcome obstacles, and especially when you're struggling with a motorcycle that you don't quite have a handle on, a rider that can take that bike and still win races and championships on it is, it's a lot of it is the drive and determination. But yeah, the personality side of it is, every rider is completely different from the other. Yeah.
Recently, Brian J. Nelson, our photographer, sent us a photo of, it didn't take me too long, but it took me a moment to know it was Rick. But it was Rick pushing the number 95 Honda. It was an Arian motorcycle. And I'm like, oh, that's Roger Hayden's bike.
Yep.
And I mean, Roger Hayden is in our paddock now. Rick is in our paddock now. Rick was crew chief for Roger during that era. And I mean, it's like I said, when you have 21 championships in Canada and the US, honestly, it's a who's who of anybody you can almost think of. It's almost hard to single any of them out. There's so many of them. And we think more recently with Cameron and what you did for him, but I mean, there was Josh Herron, you were his championship. You worked with Josh Hayes before he was with Yamaha, and it's gone back for a lot. So, I mean, it's impressive.
Yeah. Well, I've been very fortunate in having worked with some of the best riders, and, the years I was with Arian, that was our role, was as a feeder team for the factory superbike team, was to discover new talent and kind of raise them, so to speak, to understand some of the setup things and how a professional team operates and what's expected of the rider. And so you get to see these guys at a young age and hopefully help to mold them into not necessarily a championship winning rider, but a competent rider who knows a lot of the skills that it takes to be successful. So I being in the position I was in with those riders was pretty special, and I'm very honored to have worked with
a who's who.
Yeah.
Yes,
exactly.
For sure, who's who. So thank you, Rick, for being on. And, Paul, this was great, to talk about this whole thing. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is something that's near and dear to all our hearts, and it's our volunteer corner marshals that we have. We're always in need of having people at our track. MotoAmerica is coming up. It's a very big track, and it requires a lot of volunteers. We have a guy, David Hawley, who is our chief U.S. Marshal, and he's great at training people to do this. And, Rick, as race director, certainly appreciates the guys that are out there that work with him. And, Paul's the same way. I mean, we want our riders to be protected at all times, and the riders love the corner marshals. So it's the best seat in the house. You get as close as you can to the action without actually being on the race bike. So
yeah, for sure. And it's the food isn't bad as a corner worker. You get fed, and so
our hospitality is actually quite good, and you get to have that as well. But it's all part of the package, and you don't have to pay a ticket to get in. Get in touch with David Hawley at dhawley@motoamerica.com and say I want to volunteer at a future race, starting with the next one, which is Road America. So,
and you'll always have a lengthy conversation with anybody if they want it, right?
Absolutely, it's part of it. I'll sit down with you and talk about everything. So, anyway, thanks so much, Rick, and
team.
Paul, it's great.
Thank you guys.
Okay.